Good morning, Year 12 Global Politics. Today we will be focusing on the aims, the roles, and the power of the United Nations. In terms of the skills involved with this area of study, we need to be able to explain the aims and roles of the United Nations, be able to evaluate the power of the United Nations, assess the extent to which the United Nations are able to achieve their aims, and evaluate the extent to which the United Nations is able to challenge the sovereignty of states. What I've also got below is a blurb from the study design. As we know, the blurbs can be used for questions in the exam, so I've hence presented it so that you can see what they could test you on. What it says is the ongoing need for states to pursue security and stability has brought about increased examination of the role of global governance. Students will explore the aims, the roles, and the power of the IGOs, the United Nations, the IMF, the International Criminal Court. These IGOs are central to cooperative action because they establish, manage, and facilitate relations between states through their processes, protocols, and legal arrangements. So that's really, I guess, an understanding of what global governance is, that these IGOs, such as the UN, allow states to cooperate with each other because they allow states to work with each other. And also, IGOs have the capacity to challenge state sovereignty. So that's an idea of something that you could see on an exam. You could be asked to explain how the United Nations establishes cooperative action, or you could be asked, how does the United Nations allow for global governance? That could be something that you could be asked. Okay, so let's start talking about the aims of the United Nations. So we do need to be able to explain them. In terms of where I've got this information from, I have really relied on the UN Charter here because it does state these main aims. So the first aim is to maintain international peace and security, and to elaborate a little bit more on that, it means to take collective measures for the prevention and removals of threats to peace. So the United Nations are responsible for international peace and security. In terms of our examples on what we should do to talk about this, if we did have to elaborate on it, the UN has tried to do this through Resolution 2118, which was passed in September 2013, and that was in relation to the framework for the elimination of Syrian chemical weapons during the Syrian civil war. So all members really of the Security Council did agree to this. There were no vetoes in this instance, and so they did ask for Syria to eliminate chemical weapons, and it was successful to an extent at that time, because Syria did meet disarmament targets. In 2014, I think they reported that 92% of the weapons were destroyed. So that they were largely successful there. In addition, some of you may use the example of Resolution 2375, which were economic sanctions on North Korea for illegal missile activities. So that was also a success back then. Obviously, we can say that in 2022 that there has been, North Korea has still been testing missiles, but at the time when this was passed in 2013, it was successful. Another aim of the United Nations is to develop friendly relations among states, and they really do achieve this through being the main diplomatic forum for 193 states. It is the main centre in the General Assembly where states will meet to discuss these important international issues relating to humanitarian issues, or issues that are relating to peace and security. The United Nations will also aiming to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of economic, social, and cultural character, or humanitarian character. And in promoting and encouraging the respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, religion, or language. And then finally, to be the centre for harmonising the actions of nations in the attainment of these common ends. So there you go. Those are the aims. You will need to be able to explain them as well as discuss the extent to which they are able to achieve these aims. In terms of discussing how they have and how they haven't, we do have successes when the United Nations was successful. Resolution 2118 was a mild success because the 92% of the stockpile was destroyed. However, despite passing this resolution in 2013, there were 12 chemical production sites that were still operating, and a number of attacks still occurred in 2013, 2014, and 2017. So, this is mainly because of the issue with veto, with Russia and China vetoing based on their national interests. But, so sometimes the United Nations finds that they aren't actually able to achieve their aims because of states' underlying national interests and the power that veto holds in the UN Security Council. So we also need to be able to explain the roles of the United Nations. In terms of where I've got these from, they were from the website, so I've got links there to help you out. So the first aim is to maintain peace and security. So this means that they will work to prevent conflict, help states in conflict, like they may deploy peacekeepers, and basically to help countries that are dealing with these issues relating to peace and security. They will protect human rights through legal instruments such as, the High Commissioner for Refugees or, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Security Council is often a place where they will try to protect human rights by passing resolutions. So, they do try to and aim to protect human rights. The UN is also focusing on sustainable development. Oh, I've skipped one. Humanitarian aid. They do try to provide aid to countries in need. There are obviously, lots of humanitarian issues that are going on. The example that I've got there is the refugee camp in, I believe it is Kenya or Sudan, but either way, this camp really has been running since 2012. Actually, I think I've got one of those names wrong. I'm not really sure where exactly this camp is held, but I believe it was mainly to hold the refugees from Syria. It's home to 80,000 people, so nearly 20% are under the age of 5. It has formal schools, primary health services, food, water, sanitation, and shelter for refugees. This is just one example of humanitarian aid, and I've included this example because it is something that we will look at in Unit 4 when we do talk about refugees. So there you go. In terms of promoting sustainable development, they are trying to promote sustainable development because this will be, it is an issue for future generations, to help them reduce poverty and to improve the lives of people, to help protect our environment. So that's something that they are working on. And finally, to uphold international law. The UN is really the centre of international issues, and they have been also responsible for creating a lot of international laws. So sometimes this work is carried out by the Security Council or by courts and tribunals, like the International Court of Justice. And so through upholding international law, the UN may also deploy peacekeepers or pass sanctions for countries that do violate international law. Okay, so let's discuss the power of the United Nations. Their main source of power is the fact that in the General Assembly there are 193 member states. That gives them moral legitimacy and, just legitimacy in general, because most countries of the world have signed on to it. Also, the Security Council is a source of power because they can carry out missions like peacekeeping, they can apply economic sanctions, they can use force. So they are really responsible for maintaining these significant issues relating to peace and security. And really, their power kind of comes from the permanent members. Russia, China, US, France, and the UK, they in the Security Council also exercise significant power and really do have the power to approve issues relating to peacekeeping, sanctions, or force, but also can stop these issues from going forward. The General Assembly has the power to discuss, initiate studies, and consider reports and make recommendations through resolutions on any matter to do with peace and security. However, the General Assembly's resolutions are not binding, so that can be an issue. They can also initiate studies and make recommendations to promote cooperation. So they may, in the General Assembly, put forward a resolution relating to issues of peace and security. And finally, the General Assembly does consider and approve the UN budget and the final assessments of member states. So this does allow, does give the United Nations General Assembly some power. However, I did need to break this into two different slides because we do need to discuss power, or we need to be able to evaluate the power of the UN, and really the UN can be limited in the power that they have. The first way that they are limited is that the UN has no method of enforcement to bring against states who do not comply. With international laws that states may sign and ratify, but then disregard. Like Australia without the treatment of refugees. We've signed the Refugee Convention, but we still, have violated parts of that international law. And that's just one example. But the UN really has no power here to carry out any actions against us when we have broken international law. So, that can be a bit of a problem. Also, the power of veto. This really is quite a significant limitation on the power of the United Nations because the permanent 5 members do have this power, which means that they can say no to a resolution, and this does mean that the resolution won't pass, which hinders the UN from achieving their aims. And the veto is often used by states to achieve their national interests rather than helping the United Nations achieve peace and security. So what we've seen with this is since 2012, Russia has cast 17 vetoes. 12 were related to Syria because they do have naval bases in Syria and it's their main, ally in the Middle East. And China also vetoed 8 times because they don't believe in interfering in states' internal affairs. So that really has prevented the UN from achieving their aim of peace and security because the conflict and the civil war has continued despite resolutions trying to be passed in the Security Council. We've also seen this with Myanmar. So in February 2021, there was an emergency meeting with the UN Security Council regarding the coup, and no resolutions were passed. China has, an interest in Myanmar as due to trade, due to borders. So that has meant that again issues relating to peace and security have not been able to pass. So the power of veto is incredibly significant. It has prevented the UN from carrying out what they their main aims that they set out to achieve. Another limitation is the limited funding of the United Nations. They do rely on donations from states, and states sometimes are unable to provide that funding. And there are so many issues in the world right now, humanitarian issues, for example, that do require assistance and funding from the UN, and there just isn't enough to handle these issues. In terms of challenging the sovereignty of states, got a few examples here. So sometimes the UN is able to challenge the sovereignty of states. However, there are quite a few examples really here of how they have not. So we've got here the UN committees. This will become more apparent when we look at human rights and people movement in Unit 4, Area Study 1, but the UN committees only have suggestive powers, so they can only suggest to countries to take on board actions. So, with the Committee of the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, they have encouraged countries to take on recommendations related to, discrimination against women, and some countries have not adopted those recommendations. But the UN Security Council does have the power to challenge the sovereignty of states, challenge their political sovereignty or their economic sovereignty by implementing sanctions or deploying peacekeepers, especially because the decisions are legally binding and states are meant to follow the decisions of the Security Council. This can challenge the economic sovereignty or political sovereignty of a state. And we've seen this with North Korea when sanctions were passed relating to oil and petrol and exporting goods from North Korea. What we have also seen is Article 42, which does allow the UN to challenge the sovereignty of states by taking, military action by air, sea, and land forces to maintain peace and security. We have only seen this in Libya or in recent times in Libya. Unfortunately, we haven't seen it in other conflicts, and because of our time frame, we can only use examples from 2012 to 2022. It does mean that we can't talk about this example, but this does allow the UN to challenge the power of states through, a military action. So in terms of challenging the power of states, they can do this through sanctions, through peacekeepers, because those actions will challenge the economic and political sovereignty of a state. However, the use of veto in the Security Council, or the non-binding nature of resolutions in the General Assembly, don't allow the UN to challenge the sovereignty of states. So the UN can't challenge sovereignty when resolutions fail. So we've seen this in 2017 when Resolution 172 imposing sanctions relating to Syria failed. China, Bolivia, and Russia all vetoed the resolution. So this did stop the UN from being able to actually challenge, the political and economic sovereignty of the state, and also prevented them from achieving their main aim of peace and security. So there you go. That is the aims, the roles, the power, and how the UN can challenge the sovereignty of states, and also how they cannot. I hope this video was informative, and I hope you tune in for my next video. Thank you.